The Dore Lectures on Mental Science. By Thomas Troward. Lecture 9. The Story of Eden, Part 2 of 2. The fact, therefore, of our own existence is a sufficient proof of the singleness and goodness of the originating power, and from this starting point there is no second power to be taken into consideration, and consequently we do not have to study the evil that may arise out of existing or future circumstances, but require to keep our minds fixed only upon the good which we intend to create. There is a very simple reason for this. It is that every new creation necessarily carries its own law with it and by that law produces new conditions of its own. A balloon affords a familiar illustration of my meaning. The balloon with its freight weighs several hundredweight, yet the introduction of a new factor, the gas, brings with it a law of its own which entirely alters the conditions, and the force of gravity is so completely overcome that the whole mass rises into the air. The law itself is never altered, but we have previously known it only under limiting conditions. These conditions, however, are no part of the law itself, and a clearer realization of the law shows us that it contains in itself the power of transcending them. The law which every new creation carries with it is therefore not a contradiction of the old law but its specialization into a higher mode of action. Now the ultimate law is that of production ex nihilo by the movement of the spirit within itself, and all subordinate laws are merely the measurements of the relations which spontaneously arise between different things when they are brought into manifestation. Therefore, if an entirely new thing is created it must necessarily establish entirely new relations and so produce entirely new laws. This is the reason why, if we take the action of pure unmanifested spirit as our starting point, we may confidently trust it to produce manifestations of law which, though perfectly new from the standpoint of our past experience, are quite as natural in their own way as any that have gone before. It is on this account that in these addresses I lay so much stress on the fact that spirit creates ex nihilo, that is, out of no pre-existing forms, but simply by its own movement within itself. If, then, this idea is clearly grasped, it logically follows from it that the root of life is not to be found in the comparison of good and evil, but in the simple affirmation of the Spirit as the all-creating power of good. And since, as we have already seen, this same all-creating Spirit finds a center and fresh starting point of operation in our own minds, we can trust it to follow the law of its own being there as much as in the creation of the cosmos. Only we must not forget that it is working through our own minds. It thinks through our mind, and our mind must be made a suitable channel for this mode of its operation by conforming itself to the broad generic lines of the Spirit's thinking. The reason for this is one which I have sought to impress throughout these lectures, namely, that the specialization of a law is never the denial of it, but on the contrary the fuller recognition of its basic principles, and if this is the case in ordinary physical science it must be equally so when we come to specialize the great law of life itself. The Spirit can never change its essential nature as the essence of life, love, and beauty, and if we adopt these characteristics, which constitute the law of the Spirit, as the basis of our own thinking, and reject all that is contrary to them, then we afford the broad generic conditions for the specialized thinking of the Spirit through our own minds, and the thinking of the Spirit is that involution, or passing of spirit into form, which is the whole being of the creative process. The mind which is all the time being thus formed is our own. It is not a case of control by an external individuality, but the fuller expression of the universal through an organized mentality which has all along been a less perfect expression of the universal, and therefore the process is one of growth. We are not losing our individuality, but are coming into fuller possession of ourselves by the conscious recognition of our personal share in the great work of creation. We begin in some slight measure to understand what the Bible means when it speaks of our being partakers of the divine nature. 2 Peter, verse 1, chapter 4, and we realize the significance of the unity of the Spirit. Ephesians, verse 4, chapter 3. Doubtless this will imply changes in our old mode of thinking, but these changes are not forced upon us, they are brought about naturally by the new standpoint from which we now see things. Almost imperceptibly to ourselves we grow into a new order of thought which proceeds, not from a knowledge of good and evil, but from the principle of life itself. That is what makes the difference between our old thought and our new thought. Our old thought was based upon a comparison of limited facts, our new thought is based upon a comprehension of principles. The difference is like that between the mathematics of the infant, who cannot count beyond the number of apples or marbles put before him, and that of the senior wrangler who is not dependent upon visible objects for his calculations, but plunges boldly into the unknown because he knows that he is working by indubitable principles. In like manner, when we realize the infallible principle of the creative law, we no longer find we need to see everything cut and dried beforehand, for if so, we could never get beyond the range of our old experiences, but we can move steadily forward because we know the certainty of the creative principle by which we are working, or rather, which is working through us, and that our life, in all its minutes, details, is its harmonious expression. Thus the Spirit thinks through our thought, only its thought is greater than ours. It is the paradox of the less containing the greater. Our thought will not be objectless or unintelligible to ourselves. It will be quite clear as far as it goes. We shall know exactly what we want to do and why we want to do it, and so will act in a reasonable and intelligent manner. But what we do not know is the greater thought that is all the time giving rise to our smaller thought, and which will open out from it as our lesser thought progresses into form. Then we gradually see the greater thought which prompted our smaller one, and we find ourselves working along its lines, guided by the invisible hand of the creative spirit into continually increasing degrees of livingness to which we need assign no limits, for it is the expansion of the infinite within ourselves. This, as it appears to me, is the hidden meaning of the two trees in Eden, the garden of the soul. It is the distinction between a knowledge which is merely that of comparisons between different sorts of conditions, and a knowledge which is that of the life which gives rise to and therefore controls conditions. Only we must remember that the control of conditions is not to be attained by violent self-assertion, which is only recognizing them as substantive entities to be battled with, but by conscious unity with that all-creating spirit which works silently, but surely, on its own lines of life, love, and beauty. Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. Lecture 9. The Story of Eden. End of lecture. Need help understanding Troward's teachings? The Thomas Troward lectures contain very deep and powerful information, but to get the most out of them, require repeated listening and in-depth study. Troward had only one personal student, Genevieve Behrend, and her book Your Invisible Power distills the essence of Troward's lectures in a concise and easy-to-understand format. For many, this is a much preferred way to learn Troward's teachings. Click the link below this video to visit yourinvisiblepower.us and learn more about Genevieve Behrend's recently updated book.